Hello, Mr. Maisky.
Hello.
Welcome to Turkey. It's a privilege to have you here. We have some questions for you about Haydn Çello Konçerto No. 1. What were the foremost styles that possibly influenced Haydn while he was composing this concerto?
I wish we could ask him, but it's not possible. But I always say that English is not my first language, neither it is yours, of course. But even my first language, which happens to be Russian, is not exactly my best language. I hope very much that my best language is language of music. And I personally always try to express everything that I feel and understand and know about music through music itself, instead of speaking about music. I personally try to express through music itself, in this case through this beautiful Haydn C major concerto, the youthful energy and of the music. It's very young work of Haydn, and it was, as you know, of course, lost for many years and was rediscovered in Prague, in Czech Republic, I believe in 1961, something like this. And ever since it became one of the most popular concertos in cellist's repertoire, because it's not only full of energy, as I said, but it's very beautiful and very successful with the audience. It's very virtuoso piece.
It was that of display of solo virtuosity, talent, technical expertise on the part of a solo instrument in connection with or playing with an orchestra. That's the principle of the concerto. The term concerto itself implies a kind of striving together. And so in the Baroque period, as many of you probably know, it was called a concerto grosso. Concerto grosso implied a work usually just with a string orchestra, an orchestra of strings and basso continuo, so a harpsichord and a cellist playing basso continuo, and then one or more solo instruments being featured in alternation with the orchestral parts. So we have the famous concertos of Vivaldi for violin, concertos like the Four Seasons. We have the Brandenburg concertos of Bach. We have concertos by Telemann. Hundreds, well, thousands of concertos written in the Baroque period that really are purely instrumental works. That was an innovation. Works that feature solo instruments standing out from and then rejoining the orchestra, and usually preceding by a formal principle that we call the ritornello principle, ritornello, that you have a ritornello section played by the orchestra, and then you have a solo passage, and then you have a ritornello section played by the orchestra, and then another solo passage. So this kind of ritornello structure affects or determines the Baroque concerto. So what happens in the classical period, the period we're talking about now from about 1750 on, is the concerto form continues but changes. One thing that remains similar or the same is that concertos tend to have three movements. Unlike symphonies, which have four normally, concerto, even up until the 19th century, has three movements in the basic arrangement: fast, slow, fast. Very simple, but that hardly says anything about the variety. That remained the same. The other thing that remained similar was the display of virtuoso talent, But what changed was the nature of the orchestra. The style is very much in what is called the galant style. The galant style is a sort of transitional style, in a way, between the Baroque and the classical. It doesn't have some of the great contrast of dynamics or the great contrast of themes that you get in the classical style, but it attempted to create more variety than there had been in the Baroque, the high Baroque style. So you get these very elegant melodies and with a lot of decoration or ornamentation in them. Sometimes the word rococo is used. That term actually comes from art history, I believe, to indicate this very elaborate style, such as you get in some churches in the Baroque period of the early 18th century. Lots of decoration and lots of painting and lots of gold leaf and that kind of thing. But there's an element to that here. The other thing I just want to say briefly, play a little bit of the first movement of Haydn's concerto from the early 1760s, is that it starts with a ritornello for the orchestra, and then the soloist comes in playing the same material. There's a lot more common material between soloist and orchestra in this piece than there might have been in a Baroque concerto. So it's already starting to be a classical piece in that way. But the harmonies are simpler than you would get in later Haydn. But what it has in distinction to the Baroque period is it does away with some of the counterpoint and some of the counterpoint that had been part of the Baroque, and also some of the rhythmic uniformity. There's more rhythmic variety.
He was working, so to say, for Count Esterházy in Eisenstadt. And he composed, he has the orchestra there. I played in this Esterházy's castle, the festival there. This Haydn concerto and other things as well, Bach suites. And it's a beautiful place. It's an incredible chateau, castle.
So in the patronage system, maybe some of you have heard of this, there is a patron who supports the composer or the painter or the performer, and that patron pays for that person, that artist, to work for him. And Haydn's patron, most famous patron, was Prince Nicholas Esterházy, who was a very wealthy Austro-Hungarian nobleman. And Prince Esterházy hired Haydn, well, actually his brother, hired Haydn to be the court composer in 1761. So Haydn was not even 30 years old at that time. And what's remarkable about this is that Haydn stayed in service to the Esterházy family until the early 1790s, so for 30-odd years. So this is a good example of how the patronage system can sustain and support an artist. And it was not an easy life in many ways, because if you were in service to a patron, you basically were a servant. You had to do what the patron asked, and there's a very famous document that survives in music history today. It's still reproduced in many textbooks, and I'm sure it's on the web as well. Haydn's initial contract, his contract of employment with the Esterházys, and there's maybe 20 or 30 things listed that he has to do, and they include the kind of clothes he had to wear, the powdered wig that he had to wear, the kind of outfit he had to wear, the fact that if the prince wanted music at any time of day or night, Haydn had to be there, had to present the music, had to get the musicians together because he had an orchestra that he worked with. If the prince wanted music during dinner, for example, Haydn had to be there. Haydn also had to set a very good example to the people the people playing for him. He had to take care of them. He had to supervise them. So all these different conditions of employment that were pretty strict. Haydn couldn't just leave and go off to Vienna because where he was working in Esterházy was considerably outside the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of the works that Haydn wrote actually became the property of the prince because, again, the prince was paying for Haydn's, paying him a salary, paying him upkeep. And that's very much the way the patronage system worked. And Haydn often said in later years, when he had become very famous, that, well, you know, the system had advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages were that I had to stay there in Esterházy and I had to work for this prince, had to do what he said. The advantages were that I was basically on my own, and the famous quote that Haydn said, I was forced to be original, because I had to think up things, ways of composing music, so I had to become original. And that is indeed true. Haydn became very original. In fact, during this period, when he was at Esterházy, he, in a sense, invented the symphony. Now, the symphony as a form, we'll talk about this a little bit later, he didn't exactly invent it. It had been used before. People had written orchestral works called sinfonias. But there, working in Esterházy, the castle, with his orchestra, Haydn developed the form, made all kinds of innovations, and in a way, we call Haydn the father of the symphony. It's true, because eventually the 104 symphonies that he wrote became the most influential ones in the genre. Before Mozart, they inspired Mozart, and then, of course, Beethoven, and then on into the 19th century, Schumann, Brahms, even Mahler. All their works would be unthinkable without the symphonies of Haydn.
For Haydn, the symphonies were the most important orchestral works. How was composing symphonies different than composing concertos?
Yes, very good question. The symphonies were his most important orchestral works, the ones into which he clearly put the most effort, into which he saw his contribution being most valuable. As he wrote across his life 104 symphonies, really, and they extend from the early 1760s to about 1795. And in many ways, in the symphonies, he invents the classical style, the things in terms of orchestration, in terms of form, and so many things that would become important for later composers. So the symphony was a kind of laboratory for Haydn, you might say, a laboratory in which he could experiment and try things out across his symphonies. And for him, the concerto was less central. He wrote maybe 30, 35 concertos for different instruments across his life, depending on who he was with. Like when he was in the orchestra, with the orchestra in Esterházy, he wrote the cello concerto for Joseph Weigl. He wrote later on the trumpet concerto for Weidinger. And but because he himself was not a virtuoso soloist, Haydn didn't, unlike Mozart or Beethoven, Haydn didn't write concertos so much for his own display. So in a way, the orchestra was his instrument. The orchestra was Haydn's instrument.
My question is that we know that for both of these concertos, the audience was the hysteretic chord. How did this affect his composing?
This concerto was written for the orchestra and the soloists of the Esterházy Orchestra, and most likely it was performed in front of the prince and maybe a few invited guests, the prince and his family, in this castle, sort of out in the distance from Vienna, and it was a very private music, and the audience, it was not a public audience. People didn't pay for admission. People weren't invited.
The audience was, of course, luckily not just the Esterházy himself, but it was performed for larger audience as well, maybe not as large as these days. It was very important for Haydn, like for any composer in particular, but performer as well, the direct contact with the audience. It affects very much our way of playing or way of communicating with the audience, because I do believe very strongly that it's a two-way communication. I personally try to give everything I have, use all my energy in order to connect to the audience, But I always feel when the audience is responsive, then I get a lot of energy in return. So it's a two-way communication, and this is extremely important. That's why I personally prefer live concerts to studio recordings or live recordings when possible, because the presence of the audience makes huge difference for the performer and of course for the composer as well. It's very important to have this reaction of people.
Thank you very much for the questions and answers.
Thank you for the question.
It was a very enjoyable meeting, and hope to see you in the concert tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.